Okay, so let's get started. Thank you all for joining. Um, Today we are going to touch 2 points. The first one is a flashcard, velocity. I'll spend about 7 minutes on it. It's a very important concept. And then we will look at planning in general in Agile. That's going to take a lot of our time. We'll try to restrict ourselves. I do want to. I know I've been postponing the Confluence demo for past 2 weeks, past two times, um, but I want to, yeah, do it in a clean. Want to give it ample time so that I don't rush it. So next time when we meet again after 2 weeks, we will definitely have a demo of Confluence. Okay, it's a content management tool. Very nice, has very good integration. So we'll definitely talk about that. Okay, but today we are going to go over these two things. Okay, velocity and planning in Agile. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to write in your questions box that you see in the go to meeting, and I will try to answer all the questions that I see there. Okay, and towards the end also we'll reserve some time for question and answers. Okay, so let's start with velocity. So the simple definition of velocity is quantum of work a team can complete in an iteration. Okay, it's a very simple definition, very simple to understand. But it's also a very deep concept in Agile. Everything in Agile is related to velocity. So it's it's a rudimentary concept you should understand. If you don't, then it would be hard for you to be able to do anything in Agile. Okay, so what do we mean by quantum of work? Okay, also it is not a quantum of work that an individual is doing. It's a quantum of work that a team, an Agile team, is able to complete in an iteration. Okay, so we know what iteration is. It's called sprint in Scrum. So sprint and iteration, they're terminologies that can be used interchangeably. The quantum of work can have different units. Okay, it depends on what you are following. Last time, actually, the time before that, about a month ago, we were talking about story points. Okay, so story points, how story points are more accurate because they're relative and they're unitless. So a velocity most of the time would be in story points. Okay, so you can say what you see in the chart here, like you can see in this bar graph, iteration one. What you see here is about 25. So could be 25 story points. So a team was able to complete 25 story points in iteration one. And in iteration two, it was able to complete less than 20 story points. In iteration three, it was able to complete again 25. So again, Agile is good about units. So if you don't want to use story points as your units, you are not forced to use it. There are all these tools these days, Agile tools. They allow you to measure velocity using either story points or any other units that you want. Okay, other units being hours, weeks, days, months. It really depends on what you feel comfortable with. Okay, in my experience, I have experimented with both story points and units, and they have both been useful in different ways. But I think once the team becomes more and more agile, it is better to use story points. Okay, so a little more information about story points. Sorry, about velocity. So velocity is it cannot is something that you use to do forecasting. Okay, so things. You can use it to predict things. For example, in this diagram that you see, you have finished iteration 10. Okay, and you see that the team's velocity for iteration 10 is a little bit over 30. Okay, let's say 31. Okay, now when you are planning for iteration 11, a team can confidently say that we will be able to finish 30 story points. Okay, I know it, in iteration 9 they were not able to complete 30, but if you look at the trend here, you see that they have been able to sustain a velocity of about 30 story points. Okay, so in iteration 11, the team, when they're planning, they should not commit for anything more than 30 or 31. Okay, so by doing that, what you're saying is not only you are able to predict the next iteration, next sprint, you are also able to a great extent, you're able to predict how much work you can do for a release. Okay, because all the work that you're doing in iterations, it translates to a release at some point in time. Okay, so if you have your release calendar with you, if your product owner has done a release planning with a milestone date for a certain release, you can tell how many sprints you have, how many iterations you have leading up to that release, and you can just multiply that by the velocity of every iteration, and you will get the amount of story points you can do leading up to a release. Okay, very, very important information. So the velocity is a very big subject, and it's it would be difficult to cover everything pertaining to velocity here. But if you are new to Agile, just keep in mind that this is something that you will have to work with. Okay. Some of the challenges that you would see with velocity is, when you are forecasting a velocity. Okay, now, uh, uh, so how do you set an initial velocity? Let's say you've gathered a team of, let's say, 7 members. How do you how how do you decide on what is an initial velocity? Okay, so there are different ways you can do it. um, you can find another team which is similar in structure. By similar in structure, I mean a lot of things, like they have the same strength, they have same skill sets, they are working in same domain. uh, and then you can, if it is very similar to another team, then only you should use the velocity of that team when you are setting an initial velocity. Okay. However, what happens is, you would never get it right in the first iteration itself. Okay, so after you finish a few iterations, you would get a sense of how you are doing. You would be doing retros at the end of every iteration, so you'll be getting feedback. So what happens is that your velocity will get tuned. Okay, what you see in this graph here, so you can see the first 5 iterations, 1 to 5, there was a little, they were up and downs. Okay, so it was not it doesn't look a smooth uh, level bar graph, but from iteration 6 you can see it has been somewhat sustainable velocity. Okay, so it always takes a few iterations to be able to confidently predict the velocity of a team. Um, but it's always a challenge to set the initial velocity. Also, there could be a challenge when you have a new team member that is added to the team, or a team member leaves a team, or you replace a team member with somebody else. Because what happens is that a team as a cohesive whole, they learn to work with each other. There's an optimal interaction. They become a performing team. And when you introduce a new member, or you make any change to the team structure, there's a little bit of commotion that gets added. Okay, so you have to factor in that commotion. Okay, how would you do that? So usually it is a good idea, like from my experience, what I have seen is that if you're adding a new member or replacing a member with somebody else, you either you use that new person as a 75% uh, uh, performing, okay, compared to everybody else. Okay, so you can take an average and use a 75% performance for that new team member. Okay, but it really depends on who that new member is, how you're working. Sometimes you may not have just one new member. Sometimes you may have multiple team members who are getting changed. Okay, these days it is not unusual that the organizations who are running multiple scrum teams or multiple agile teams, they move the resources between those teams. So it's not very unusual. So there's always some objective way, some calculative way that you may have to come up with to kind of to set a velocity. All the tools these days, agile tools, like I'm a big fan of Greenhopper, which is a plugin for Jira. They allow you to view your velocity like in a good bar graph, like what you're seeing here on the screen. Also, one more thing to keep in mind. I know I'm going a little more on velocity, but it's such an important concept. Velocity is not not directly proportional to the productivity of the team. Okay, so productivity is a different attribute altogether. Productivity means that what you're doing it in a most efficient way, most optimal way, and there's uh, you're able to deliver in the most efficient way possible. Okay, that is productivity. However, velocity is how much work you're actually putting out as a team. Okay, so there's a difference. Okay, so just because two teams, they have the same structure, same kind of skill sets, it does not necessarily mean just because one team is having a higher velocity than the other team does not always mean that they also are more productive. Okay, I've seen very seasoned agile coaches make that mistake of comparing teams using velocity. It's not apples to apples comparison. Okay, all right. So I see that there are some questions coming in already. I'm going to table them for a little while after, once we finish talking about the planning in Agile. Okay, I'm going to come back to you. All right, so let's move on. So the second agenda item that we have today is planning in Agile. Okay, I've split it in two parts. Okay, first part is the planning onion. Uh, it, for those of you who are planning to take the ACP certification from PMI, it is not unusual that they will use this word planning onion sometimes. Okay, you can see this. So it looks like an onion here. There are layers that you can peel and go deeper in the core. The way it's represented here is, it's trying to depict what we term as agility. Okay, and how we can really how we can plan if we understand these layers. So there's a planning aspect on every layer. Okay, now on the layer that is outside, okay, you can see it's a strategy layer. Okay, so strategy, usually the planning for strategy is done maybe once a year. Okay, typical for an organization, a mid to large level organization, that they review their strategy, their vision, their goals, etc. Once a year. Okay, beneath that layer you have a release layer. Okay, so release is your product releases. um, Typically you have a release every 2 or 3 months, so let's say a quarterly frequency. So you're planning for your releases maybe every 3 months, every quarter. Okay, so you're having release planning there, you're adjusting your backlog, you're taking feedback from the customers. So there's there's a lot of planning that is going at the release layer, release level. Okay. Beneath that layer, you have the layer of iteration or sprints. Okay, so if you remember, if you were there in the very first webinar in this series, you remember we talked about Scrum and how we have the sprint planning. Okay, sprint planning is a very common meeting. Everybody knows about it. That's nothing but your iteration planning, okay, which is at this layer, what you see. The iteration layer, the planning that uh, you're creating sprint backlog, you have retrospective, you have sprint review. So you're doing all that good stuff at the iteration level. And usually your iterations, if you're following Scrum or even XP, your iterations are usually anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks. So that's the frequency at which you're doing planning at the iteration level. Beneath the iteration layer, you have a daily layer. Okay, so at the daily level, you're doing stand-ups, you're reviewing stories. Okay, reviewing stories, and if you're reviewing stories, you're reviewing stories against the acceptance criteria or the acceptance tests or the success criteria. Okay, so that whole planning is also done at the daily level. And then at the very core, you have the last layer, which is even finer than the daily layer, which is, you're doing continuous things there, like you're doing test driven development. Okay, we talked about test driven development, I think in the last webinar or the webinar before that. So you're doing test driven development, you're doing building, you're doing continuous integration, you're doing collaboration, which is happening very, very frequently, okay, multiple times during the day. Okay, so sometimes you may have to do planning for that too. Okay, so this is what a planning onion looks like. At the end of it, you get a working software, the big arrow that you see at the bottom here. And surrounding this, you have the visibility, which is, which could be in one word, can be put in 2 words, it can be put in as information radiator. So we talked about information radiator as well some time ago. But all these burn down, burn up charts, velocity, which we just talked about, all these things they form the visibility aspect of this whole planning onion. Okay, so how you're going to look at it, you have all the test metrics, and there are a lot of metrics in Agile. I will be taking them up one by one. Velocity is one of the very rudimentary metrics, very rudimentary. And then you also have the values. These are Agile values. um, I would be taking a session just going through the Agile manifesto. Agile manifesto has the 12 Agile practices and 4 values. So those of you who are curious, you can just go to agilemanifesto.org right away, and on the landing page, in the first page itself, you'll see all of that. What are the 4 values and the 12 practices? Okay, so adaptability, transparency, simplicity, unity. These are all, different values and principles of agility. All right. Let me see if there are any questions so far. Okay, so we can wait. All right. All right, so just remember, okay, these are this planning onion. Start from the strategy outside where you have planning done maybe once a year, all the way down to continuous integration, test-driven development, okay, which is at even finer than a daily level. All right, so let's delve deep into planning now. Now, okay, there's a lot of going on this slide. I don't want you to get distracted by all the colors here. We will look at almost everything here. Okay, so let's start from the left hand side. Okay, where you have this solid red color box saying product planning. Okay, and let's see all what is coming out and what is going in there. Okay, so the most important thing here, is, if you remember the Scrum roles, there's a product owner. Okay, so this slide is more inspired from the Scrum uh, terminologies. Okay, but it is true in general in Agile also it is true. So from once you come to a planning level in Agile, it's you have to first do a product planning. Okay, product planning is a very extensive, continuous, uh, and uh, a very uh, important task that people like product owner have to do on a daily basis. Okay, so it is not just it's not like one time planning and you're done. It is a continuous, regular thing. Okay, for so many reasons. Okay, so the, the product owner understands the business case, understands the vision. Okay, you can see all these things that are coming out from the product planning. There are a lot of other things that are going on in product planning, like what is your definition of done. Okay, we haven't gone through the definition of done, but for short, what is the criteria that will what is a checklist that would tell a team member or a team that a particular story is complete. Okay, what is that criteria, or what is that checklist that that you can use, that you can refer to when you're closing, marking a story closed. Okay, so that is definition of done. Okay, we'll talk more about that in forthcoming webinars. And then, what is the duration of your sprints? How are you going to, how many sprints, how you want to do your release planning? What is your release plan? How many sprints would go into a release? Okay, so how are you going to measure your work, whether you're going to use story points or you're going to use absolute units? Okay, what are the different artifacts that you would use? What are the standards? What are metaphors and guidelines that you would be using in your product? Okay, while you're building your product as well. Okay, so there are a whole bunch of things that are a part of this product planning. Okay, look at that. All the documentation. What are the acronyms, references? What is the review process for your release planning, for your user stories? Okay, what would be processes? What are the processes that you'll be following for coding? Okay, what are listing down. What would be included when you're estimating, what all you should be aware of when you're doing estimations. Okay, so it goes down to a very fine level, but I think the most important thing from product planning point of view is the release planning. Okay, which you see here in this big red giant arrow box. Release plan is one of the biggest things that as a product owner have to keep in mind at all times. Okay, and then you have all this business case and vision also has a template. What you see down here, um, it's something that was developed by Jeffrey Moore. Okay, a very cool vision template. Not going to go into the details of that, but vision, business case, team, user stories, product backlog, release plan, logistics, sprint duration, definition of done, okay, or done definition. Um, all these things, they are a part of product planning. Okay, so we take all these things together, and it results in this product backlog. Okay, so as a product owner, when you have to create a product backlog, not only you have to create one, you have to keep updating it, you have to keep maintaining it. Okay, as a part of that maintenance, you are doing that product planning itself, okay, to a great extent. Now, in the product backlog is of various different types. Okay, I have a different blog which is talking about the details of every type, but at a minimum, you can understand this. There's a prioritized product backlog, there is a risk adjusted product backlog, there is a release product backlog. Okay, there are different flavors or different types of product backlogs. Now, product backlog, I'm just going to repeat the definition that we had gone through a few months ago already. It's the union of all the stories or all the features that you would want in a product and that are unfinished. Okay, so all the unfinished work represented as user stories is what constitute the product backlog. Okay, and when I say user stories, I'm also including epics in them because epics are also stories. You know, in a way, they are also stories. Okay, because they decompose themselves into user stories. Okay, now at this time when you have the product backlog, you are at a point where you can start doing execution. By execution, I mean engineering development work. So once you have product backlog, you do, and at this point, you also know how you're going, how you are going to to space your sprints. So you have, let's say, 2 week sprints. So you'll start doing sprint planning. At this time, you know your team. You have identified what your team members are, who's your scrum master, who's your product owner. You understand the team structure very well. You understand the sprint process of Agile, and then you start doing execution. So first thing you would have to do is sprint planning. Okay, you understand the product backlog. The team sits together, product owner understands what is the priority in that product backlog. Okay, because product backlog is, again, it's being regularly adjusted. So you understand what are the priorities. Based on those priorities, your priorities are nothing but your user stories listed in a rank or in an order of priority. As a part of sprint planning, you would drive clarity on those user stories. You make sure that you understand the description very well. You make sure that you understand the success criteria or the acceptance criteria very well. You understand what is in scope, what is out of scope. Okay, you understand the great details of what that feature is trying to achieve, what value we are adding to the product. Okay, while you do that, you also do the estimation. Okay, so you do estimate for every story, and if you are knowledgeable enough, and if you have good experience in Agile, you would be able to use story points. Okay, so you're using story points to do estimation, and now it comes to a point where you want to set an initial velocity of the team. Okay, which goes back to my previous slide where I was telling how we can set, what are different ways we can set an initial velocity of the team. Okay, so you set a velocity that I'm going to take up 60 story points or 30 story points in the first iteration. Okay, you work on those stories that you have committed against that velocity. So if if you find all the stories which summate up to 30 story points, if you've set the velocity of 30, and commit to those stories that you're going to, in the next 2 weeks, you're going to try and finish these stories. Okay, so then you're running the sprint, which is this green box here. Okay, at the time of sprint. Now the sprint planning, when we are talking about it, is not unusual for uh, organizations these days to have multiple teams. Okay, the place where I'm working right now, we have about 6 to 7 different scrum teams. Okay, so you'll have multiple scrum teams, and they would all start at the same time. They will all finish their sprints at the same time. It is important to coordinate, the start and end of the sprints as well, so that you can. It makes it easier to uh, collaborate if needed, to do scrum of scrums, which is kind of learn from each other team, not just from individuals. And also, you want to be aligned with the release. Okay, for all the scrum teams that we have, it is the same release. They're working towards the same release. Okay, so they're in tune with the same sprint plan per se. So when you're running sprint, you would have you'll be doing all the good stuff that you do. You do daily stand-ups, you do test-driven development, you do collaboration. Okay, you're doing you're doing testing collaboratively. You are doing builds. You're doing continuous integration while you're doing while you're in the sprint. So after 2 weeks, when you finish, and while you're running that sprint, you also have all those matrices that are coming out of it, like the burn down chart. Very important. Okay, burn down chart is one of the rudimentary um, artifact that anyone would look at to see how we are progressing in the sprint. Okay, versus planned. So burn down chart, very important. Okay, I will be taking another webinar on the burn down chart as one of the core subjects. Once you finish the sprint, you have something called as the sprint review. Okay, so sprint review happens. Sprint review is kind of a informal demo, as it says here. Okay, so you look at what you had committed initially in the sprint based on your velocity, and at the time of sprint demo, you look at what you were able to complete, what you were able to achieve. Okay, and you look at it at with a very fine objective eye. So you are kind of showcasing what you have developed, and it is not just showcasing to to the product owner or the stakeholders, but to yourself as well. Okay, at this time, it's again kind of a feedback to product owner as well, like what functionality they had asked for, what was built, and kind of match the two. Okay, at a high level. Okay, now once you have finished the sprint review, there is sprint retrospective, and I think I've brought up retrospective many times in the course of this free webinar series. So sprint retrospective is kind of lessons learned. Okay, but it is at the sprint level, at the iteration level. So there are three questions that you try to answer. Okay, what is working very well and we should continue doing, what is not working and we should continue and we should stop doing, and what is it that we have to start doing. Okay, so team members, they take turns in answering these three questions. Usually it is the scrum master or agile coach who is hosting the sprint review. Product owner also has to be a part of this sprint retrospective because their inputs are also important. They usually product owner and QA members, they have the most inputs for retrospective, and they're always valuable. Okay, everyone's input is valuable, and you want to create action items from them. Okay, you just cannot just understand all these, the answers of these three questions, but also you have to take it as a scrum master, scrum coach, agile coach. You want to take them further to make sure that this rich feedback is actually going to help you and your team in the next iteration, next sprint. Okay, so now just want to touch upon a few important points here. So backlog. So again, this whole cycle is repeating itself. So this is how you're running how you have planned yourself in Agile. Okay, you have a product planning and you have product backlog that comes out of it, and the release dates. From there, you do sprint planning, you run the sprint, you do sprint review and retrospective, and do the same cycle over and over again. Okay, and in every cycle, you're becoming better because you're getting feedback, you are improving yourself, you are able to reach a point where you have a sustainable velocity. Okay, you have a sustainable pace. Very important concept again. It is possible that sometimes a team may kill themselves and over deliver, or there may be a spike where you are able to put out more sprint more story points in a particular sprint just because you worked extra. But it doesn't mean that you'll be able to do that in every sprint. Okay, you have to find a sustainable pace, a pace that you can sustain yourself indefinitely. Okay, so this is a cycle. Now, while you're running the sprint, that is when most of the action is happening, and it's important that that you know that, that you as scrum master, agile coach, have a very clean and very very thorough eye on what's going on. Okay, one of the ways of doing that is by keeping an eye on the burn down chart. Okay, but there are all these other things also happening, which is like stand up meetings, the daily scrum. There are daily scrums, and there are blockers. We looked at Kanban last time, and Kanban is a great visual way of keeping a tab on the progress. Okay, if you have a blocked column in Kanban, as a scrum master, your priority becomes to make sure that this you remove everything from that blocked column. There should almost never be anything in the blocked column. Okay? The moment you find the blocker, you have to resolve that blocker. Okay, so that's where all the action is happening. Also, it is not unusual for teams to kind of club sprint review and sprint retrospective meetings together. It becomes a one big meeting, one big ceremony. But it is helpful at times that you demo and you also do retrospective at the same time while you're demoing, kind of learning from the mistakes that you may have made or what you can do better. Also, it is not unusual that you do sprint review, not a sprint review, you kind of do showcasing or you do demo at multiple times during the sprint. Okay, what it's kind of an advanced way of thinking or looking at things. Once you have, so you do it for critical stories, what you can do is you can showcase it as soon as it is finished instead of waiting for it to reach the end of the sprint. Okay, it has its pros and cons, but it has been working very well for some of my scrum teams, and it's something to ponder about. I mean, if you are already running agile teams, it's and if you are curious, you can experiment with that. It has worked very well for a few of my teams here. So coming back to product planning on the left hand side again. So while you're doing all these sprint related planning, you always have to keep an eye on product planning. Product owner is the whole and sole owner of the product, the whole product. However, there's a caveat that there are always non-functional stories as well. So let me just rephrase that statement. The product owner is responsible for all the functional stories in the product. Okay, there could be a different product owner or an engineering owner who would be responsible for the non-functional or the engineering part of the product. Okay, engineering stories. Okay. So regardless, I mean, the product owner has to be has to regularly update the product backlog. Okay, it is a constant, it is not an easy thing. It requires a lot of discipline, it requires a lot of analysis, and it requires a lot of feedback. Okay, so the more, if you're working as a scrum master or you aspire to work as a scrum master, it is of uh, it's very important that we keep the communication channel open at all times between product owner and the team. Okay, because it's a great way of sharing knowledge. It's a great way of giving feedback to product owner. Okay, which helps them in prioritizing, which helps them planning releases. Okay, because release is everything. A product release is when you're giving out the value to the customer. That's when the end customer is actually seeing things that are working. All right, so let me let me take a little bit of break here, look at all the questions that we may have, and then we will just test our knowledge from what we have learned today. Okay, so the first question here, so velocity is dependent on dev team size. Uh, yes and no. If you if you add, let's say you have been running some sprints already with let's say 7 members, and you add an eighth member, you expect your velocity to go up. Yes. um, it's it's also possible that you have two different teams. One team has 7 members, the other team has 9 members, and the 7 member team has higher velocity than the 9 member team. It's very much possible. So I wouldn't make it a rule of thumb, okay, because velocity is really how many stories, how many story points you're able to put out. Okay, there are for if you are talking about just one team, yes, the velocity would increase or decrease with increase and decrease in the team members. Very true. Okay, another question here is how how is velocity used to do release planning? Okay, good question. So I think um, uh, so we understand that the sprints that we are running, iterations that we are running, they lead up to a release. Okay, so in my experience recently, we have been running sprints that are 2 weeks long, and we have release every 2 months. Okay, so every 4 sprints, 4 or 5 sprints, they go into a release. Okay, when we have when we have a um, when you know the velocity of a team, let's say my team's velocity is 30 story points, I multiply it by 5. So I know as a scrum master, I know as a team member, and I also as a product owner, I know that I can only complete stories that add up to 150 story points for the whole release. Okay, so if you if your product backlog is mature, if you have prioritized your product backlog very well, and you want to set a milestone for a release, you may want to know how many stories from that product backlog are actually reasonably going to make it to that release. If there is something big that you have to put out in that release, you can either, and it is not making in to that release because of your velocity, you would have to either put those stories up in the backlog, okay, or trade those stories with something else that you have in the backlog that is going in the release, or you can move your release date. Okay, so a lot of times it happens that you are towards the end, let's say you're in the fifth iteration, and you have a release that is coming up, the iteration 5 work, all the work that you have done up to iteration 5 has to go into the release. It's always a crunch time in iteration 5. Okay, you're trying to put out functionalities which is absolutely needed in that release. Okay, so the idea is, we talked about risk adjusted backlog, prioritized backlog. You want to make sure that you have all your big features that you have committed to the client for a particular release, you keep them up in your iterations. Okay, so if your product backlog is correctly prioritized, your release dates uh, are well planned. Knowing the velocity, you can always confidently say that I'll be able to cover all these things in a particular release. Okay, and then you can commit to the customer rather than other way around. Okay. uh, okay, all right, another question about the release. uh, actually, I think it's so. When we are doing product planning, one of the important things in product planning is release planning. Okay, it has other things as well. It has product backlog updates. It has uh, you know definition of done creation. It has planning for all the other things pertaining to agile, like what is your sprint duration, how many team members you're going to have, who's going to be the scrum master, how you're going to divide your teams, how many scrum teams you're going to have, you know um, what are different processes that you would be following, if you have to do documentation, what are the things, what are the metaphors that you're going to use. So it has a lot of things, so not just release planning. Okay, another question. Can you get a copy of the image? Yes, I'll send it out. Just this one. It's it's a good slide to look at. Like you can look at the slide for hours together and learn a lot from it. The important thing here is, and in reality, there's a lot more in agile planning than what you see on just this slide. Okay, and you get acclimated to things, as you work along. So those of you who are new to agile, who have just started working in agile or not working in agile right now, my suggestion is that you try to understand everything that is there on this slide, uh, at a high level, and then as you're going along, you would understand all these things better. Okay, and you'll understand a lot more things here. Okay, I will share the slide. Yes. Okay, another question. What if the requirements user stories are uh, what if the requirements stories developing as we go through the iteration? Do we plan for first and second iteration first or second? Okay. All right, I think I understand the question. So the question is that, when we are planning for sprint, are we planning for more than just one sprint? It's a good question. So what we do is that you start when you start a sprint, sprint planning for the next sprint starts early. Okay, starts before the actual sprint starts. Okay, so let's say you're in sprint one, and your sprint is 2 week long. You may want to start planning for sprint two 3 or 4 days before the next sprint. Okay, you may want, you will not be just planning for sprint two, you will be doing the first sprint work, but you'll start doing the groundwork. Okay, the idea is that, you understand, you have a good idea about what stories you're going to do in which sprint. So it's a good idea to start parking your user stories in future sprints. Okay, it is a great way of understanding dependencies as well. Ideally, user stories should not have dependencies. Okay, but we of course not live in the ideal world. There are dependencies, no matter how much we try to avoid them. um, so if you start parking your user stories that you have in your release backlog, you would understand the dependencies. You would spend less time in doing sprint planning for the subsequent sprints. Okay, because you started doing a little bit of planning on a very high level, at the level of release planning. Okay, so when you're doing release planning, it is a great idea to start parking your stories in uh, recent sprints. You may not be able to, if 5 sprints are going into one release, you may not be able to park all the stories in all 5 sprints, because then you lose that flexibility of changing things in the backlog, reprioritizing things in the backlog. But you want to start parking stories in sprint 2 and sprint 3 while you are still working in sprint 1. Hopefully that answers that question. Yes, this session will be available. There'll be a recording. that will be available on YouTube. There's a YouTube channel that I have where you have recording for older sessions as well. Everybody will get the slide. Okay. So there's a question about PDU. So I think this free session is worth one PDU. I suggest that you email Aditya at searchschool.com, uh, or you can reply to the original invite you got for the registration, or you can just write an email to me and I'll point you to him. So just email him. I don't know if he's on here right now to comment on how the PDUs can be obtained for this session. If you want 21 PDUs for the whole PMI certification, there is a webinar training that I hold once every month. We had one uh, last weekend, the weekend of I think third and fourth, which is a very aggressive, very rigorous training. 8 to 9 hours a day, and it covers everything that is under the umbrella of PMI's Agile certification and more. I think some of you who have been attending my free webinars, there were quite a few last minute registrations. So I have a slide that gives you the URL for that registration. You'll see that in a little bit. Okay. Uh, okay. So the question is, in one release, I have 5 sprints. In the fifth sprint, do I expect to test functionality of the previous sprints? No. So um, what you're doing is, when we talk about user stories, the user story is a total thing. Okay, it is not like you're doing development in one story, then you're doing testing in a different story for the same feature. One story is one story. You do design, you do develop, you do QA, you do everything in that one story, and you don't close that story until you have finished doing that. Okay, and you do that in every sprint. If you say that I have committed stories A, B, and C in sprint 1, you do everything for that stories A, B, and C in that sprint and close them. Okay, in sprint 5th, you would be committing to stories E, F, G. Okay, and you'll do everything for those stories E, F, G in that sprint 5. Okay, the recording is available on YouTube. Uh, did not get the email from last session. Okay. Yes. So I will email everybody who is in this group. I will tell them about the location of that YouTube channel. I'll also specify the webinar if you are interested in that webinar. It seems like some of you are. The 21 PDUs webinar, the whole agile training for PMI ACP certification. I will send you the link to register for that as well. Okay. The next one is on 7th and 8th of September. Okay. Doesn't the next sprint planning during the current sprint impact velocity of the current sprint? Maybe not, but yeah. So yes. So your question is more from the point of so you reserve time to do planning for the next sprint. Okay, there are different ways teams approach. Okay, sometimes I think I did mention that when I was training the, uh, the sprint planning a few webinars ago. It's you reserve time in every sprint to do planning for the next sprint. As per Scrum, you reserve about 8 hours in every sprint to do sprint planning for the next sprint. Okay, so your velocity should not get affected. Your velocity is kind of a sustainable pace, what you can do. So if you're in sprint 1, you'll reserve time for sprint 2. When you're sprint 2, you reserve time for sprint 3. Okay. All right. So let's quickly look at some of the knowledge that we have gained. Let's quickly through some of the questions that I have here. I'm going to start a poll. You can answer. Okay. So the first question should be on your screen now. Just go ahead and answer to the best of your knowledge. There'll be four options. Go ahead. Okay, I'll be closing the poll in 30 seconds. Okay, so a lot of you got it right. Okay, so the correct answer is D. If it is not the first iteration, sorry, the if it's not the first iteration, uh, use the velocity that is sustainable. Okay, so it goes back to sustainable pace. All the other options are wrong. Okay, you cannot just randomly pick velocity. You cannot use an average of the past velocity. Okay, so just remember, okay, velocity, you want to find a velocity that is sustainable. Okay, I'm going to launch another poll. Second question, please go ahead and answer. Okay, another 30 seconds. Okay, not everybody attempted, but most of you got it right. The correct answer is retrospective is done at the end of the sprint. It is not done at the beginning. It is not done at the end of the release, and it's not. It, it cannot be done at just some random time. It should be done at the end of the sprint. Okay. And one more question. I know we are going just a little bit over time, but all good stuff. Okay, go ahead and answer this one too, and we're done. 30 more seconds. Okay, great. Yes, I think most of you got this one right too. The correct answer is whole team. That includes product owner, the whole team, all the team members, and Scrum Master, etc. Some of you answered. It's kind of a trick question. Some of you answered all the stakeholders. Just remember, okay, stakeholders. Just because somebody is a stakeholder doesn't mean that they have to have a hand in planning. Okay, planning is usually done by people who are actually going to do the execution. People who are doing prioritization. So product owner is doing prioritization, team members, Scrum Master, they're all involved in the execution. Okay. Scrum Master alone is not responsible for the planning. Okay. Remember, in Agile, everything is collaborative effort. All right. So we're almost out of time. Just want to show this last slide. So the next free webinar is going to be on the 30th of August. Okay. 2 weeks from now. And those of you who are interested in the ACP training, Agile training, that will give you 21 PDUs. The next one is on 7th, I have a spelling mistake here, is on 7th and 8th September, okay, Saturday and Sunday. It's going to be an all-day training on webinar, just like this one. It'll be very interactive. You'll get to ask questions. You'll hear my personal experience, transformation, on Agile transformation. Um, and it covers everything that is under the umbrella of PMI's ACP outline. Okay, and you can register on this website, Search School's website. Just go to Agile Classes, click on Webinar, and you'll see the schedule, and you can register there. And if you have any questions, I mean, these are different channels. You can approach me, Gmail, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. I'm hearing a question. What was the Agile website that I mentioned during? I don't remember mentioning a specific website. Uh, I may have mentioned the Search School website. So the URL that you see on your screen right now in the slide, that's the Search School's website. I think you're referring to the agilemanifesto.org, where you can see all the Agile values and the 12 practices. There are 4 Agile values and 12 practices. Agilemanifesto.org. You can go there right now. And the question is, can I take CSM certification after ACP webinar? No, you cannot. We are working Search School. Aditya and I, we are working on setting up that as well, which is going to be a different training than this PMI ACP training. Slightly different, more focused on Scrum only. Okay, so once you take that particular training, you'll be eligible for taking CSM certification. Agile coach and Scrum masters, it's the same. Scrum master is more of a Scrum methodology. Agile coach is a general methodology. Okay, what are some other Agile methods? There's Scrum, there's XP, there's Lean, there's Kanban. Some people treat Kanban as a separate Agile methodologies. There's FTD, there's Crystal method, there ASD. There are quite a few, but Scrum, XP, Lean, these are the most common, most popular ones. Okay. Um, QA, I'm gonna help you. I know you're waiting for the password for the website from the training. Uh, I'll help you with it. All right. Thank you so much. We went a little bit over time, but it was all good discussion. I hope you learned. You feel a little more knowledgeable after today, and I hope to see you soon on the 30th August free webinar that I have on Friday, same time. Okay. Thank you. Bye bye.